Okay, good morning, everybody. Just so you know, to qualify for credits, your PDP stuff, you have to be obviously in attendance, and your camera will have to be on in order to qualify for any credits. Generally speaking, as mentioned before, they're one credit per meeting kind of thing. So it's not, I wouldn't imagine it's something that's going to make or break your PDP cycle, but still important to participate in order to get the credits if you want to make sure that you accumulate them. So that being said, it is 18 credits that's required, which is only 3 courses throughout a 2-year cycle. So we hopefully, we won't see too many people scrambling to get PDPs by the end of their 2 years, although I bring it up because, we still see the odd person who's a month away from renewing their license going, oh my God, what do I do? So today wanted to touch base on some clause writing and some techniques in dealing with tenant occupied properties. And Matt, you were asking a little bit about potentially renegotiating the results of a home inspection. For example, and there's a number of clauses out there. There's a very sort of vague clause that the Victoria Real Estate Board provides on their condition addendum, and then there's a pretty lengthy wordy clause inside web forms. So inside web forms, under that clause tab, hopefully you're all familiar with it. That is a library of standard clauses that has been prepared by lawyers and regulators and given to us basically to hopefully make our lives a little bit easier. Generally speaking, they're worded very specifically and they show, and there's clarity and a specific metric to be met. And when you're writing a subject clause, for example, then having that measurable metric is really, really, really important in order to validate, because we talked a little bit yesterday about having a clause in a contract and not removing it because something else came up. That does come with risk, as Peter DeMeo mentioned. Although it's a minimal risk, there is a little bit of risk involved in going down that road and utilizing one clause to get out of a contract that relates to a separate issue. The home inspection clause is probably it's one of those that is a little bit gray, and it is similar to subject to viewing and approving the property. It really leaves it up to the buyer to decide whether or not they're happy with it, and ultimately that's what the clause is stating. The home inspection clause, some realtors will have a conversation with their clients, and when they're preparing an offer, we'll put this clause in, and then we will just use this to renegotiate the price down the road. Oftentimes that happens, but in all honesty, when we put that clause in there, the goal of that is to make sure that the buyer is fully aware of everything they possibly can be, and it confirms what they're purchasing and the condition that they're purchasing it. Generally speaking, a listing realtor will do an evaluation on the property, and it will be priced accordingly. If something in an inspection comes up that isn't reasonably discoverable, then that can be an opportunity to attempt a negotiation, but it doesn't mean that you can negotiate. You can always ask a question. The issue that might come up might be something that the seller is completely aware of and they factored in as far as pricing their property and putting it on the market. The number one goal there is to make sure that your buyer is aware of everything. So you can always ask and attempt to renegotiate a price reduction or something. Perhaps the seller will do some work from the results of the inspection or whatever it may be. However, they don't have to. They're not obligated to. And at some point, your buyer is going to be in a position where this is the deal. You're not going to get any more. You're not going to get any less. This is what's provided to you. This is all the information. And ultimately, that's what we want to get them. We want to get them all the information so they can make an informed decision. So if there is an issue, sure, you can ask and try to negotiate a repair or a price reduction. But ultimately, the buyer is going to have to make a decision on whether or not they want to move forward. When that's the case, and there's not an ability to renegotiate or add a term or a price reduction or something like that, a good conversation to have, with your buyer is this something that you're willing to let go of this property for? Your buyer is going to be invested in the process. They're obviously invested in the property, having gone through due diligence, and even just making an offer, it shows their interest. So, instead of focusing on, what that one particular issue is, it's a good practice to kind of step back and say, we know all this. This came up, obviously, it's going to probably cost a little bit of money. Are we willing to lose this property for that? Like tomorrow, if we don't remove conditions, are you going to feel a little bit of regret or a little bit of remorse for letting this one go? You have to take all the information, establish what it is, and say yes or no. Does that I know you were asking questions about negotiations and stuff, Matt. Does that kind of touch on what you were asking about, or a little more clarity? Or
I was looking more for the technicals when you're going to actually say reduce a price because of an inspection. Where would you reduce the price at? Would you scratch out the contract, or would you make an addendum, or what?
Yeah, so generally speaking, most listing realtors and most sellers, if they do agree to it, they'll probably want assurance that the balance of conditions is going to be removed at the same time. So the best tactic when asking for a price reduction is when you're ready to remove all conditions. When there are no more questions and your buyer is good to go, when you proceed to that condition removal phase, that's probably the most strategic time to do it, because you can leverage the fact that you're ready to remove all conditions. However, we just have this one little issue that we need to deal with, and would you consider? That being said, when you structure it, there's two ways you can do it. One would be drop an amendment, noting and clarifying what the price reduction is, or what the purchase price will be moving forward. Have that signed, get it back, and then send the condition removal. It's typically, you want to make sure that you either have that amendment in place before subject removal, or you do it at the same time, ensuring that the documents are tied together, because they are done on two separate forms. Amendments are not done on a condition removal form. So you need to make sure that there's two pieces of paper there. And also you need to ensure that they're collated. There you have page one of one, or sorry, page one if it's a standard subject removal and a single line amendment. Your amendment is going to be page 1 of 2, and your subject removal is going to be page 2 of 2. It ties the documents together, and it ensures that the seller has to accept one before they accept another. You never want to send them together as separate documents, like an amendment that's page 1 of 1, or a subject removal that's page 1 of 1, because ultimately what can happen, and I have seen it, and it can cause cause challenges down the road. The seller will accept the condition removal without signing the price reduction or whatever amendment was agreed to, and they are under no obligation to sign and send that back. When you send it to them, it is essentially a request. You're asking them to do something. If they don't sign it, then they send it back. And if you've given them the subject removal, then your hands are tied, and it's a very difficult conversation to have with your buyer. So get the amendment first, or link it to the subject removal so that it's page 1 of 2, and your SR would be 2 of 2, or you send the SR completely separate after the amendment has been signed and returned. Does that help? Awesome.
Hey, Darren.
Hey, Andy.
Would you run into any difficulties with the subject removal? Like, if let's say they didn't agree to the price reduction, and you're like, well, I'm not gonna remove subjects. Could they come after you and be like, well, why aren't you removing subjects? I mean, the price reduction had nothing to do with the subjects that you had on the offer, or does it? I mean, would it be because you found something that would cost the
Exactly.
potential buyer money, like to fix?
Yeah, absolutely.
That's
Yeah.
what would link it.
Yeah, absolutely. That's 100% it. And you have to be, you know, when buyers want to utilize the results of an inspection, it's you know, usually it's to leverage some sort of negotiation or price, but it's you know, it can't really be something that, you know, it is obvious or glaring. And I know we've chatted a little bit about it in the past, but you know, that's why it's important when we're taking our clients through, you know, on viewing, you know, what we do to help prepare our clients for that inspection is really important, because inspection reports can be very lengthy, they can be very wordy, and they will detail and indicate a lot of things and a lot of potential challenges and some general maintenance issues that they're going to have to deal with one way or another. You know, if the window seal is broken, or there's a cracked window, or you know, when you're in the basement or the crawl space and you're looking at a furnace that, you know, looks like it used to belong to your grandfather, you know that, you know, that particular appliance or that item is due for replacement or some sort of maintenance. You don't need a home inspector to tell you that. That's visual, and those little things that you pay attention to and things that you bring up with your buyer clients helps soften the impact of potentially an inspection report, especially for first-time buyers and young buyers that haven't gone through the process and are not familiar with inspection reports and that kind of stuff. You know, some inspectors can be, you know, very, very diligent and very thorough, and you know, they write their reports obviously to limit their own liability, so they're going to put absolutely everything and every disclaimer in those reports. And you know, if you've got a, you know, a furnace that's 20 years old, you know, they're going to have replace immediately, like immediate replacement, and usually it will be in big bold red letters, and somebody who's not familiar with the process will look at that, and they'll have an impact when they're reading that document, and it can really affect you know, their decision process. It's, you know, it'll become very emotional. They can become overwhelmed with the potential of having to, you know, spend 5 to 10 grand on a furnace, or 5 grand on replacing windows, and those are all things, like I said, that we should really be pointing out. And we're not there to say you're going to have to do this, you're going to have to do this, but you know, we look at the furnace and it's like, you know what, that's likely a little bit older than what the manufacturer suggests it should be, and that's ultimately what the home inspector will tell you. They will base their analysis on the manufacturer's life expectancy of a furnace or a hot water tank or that kind of stuff. It's pretty general knowledge. For example, a hot water tank, you've got 10 years. And that actually can cause, you know, an impact on insurance and stuff as well. So when you're going through and you're looking at the house, take some notes and look for these little things that will come up in a home inspection that you can temper or prepare your buyer for having to work through.
Darren, just to add to that, the seller's perspective on that and how I typically will try and protect my sellers is I'll add some extra language if I feel like a buyer might be coming or trying to, from the beginning, make this a negotiation tactic on the nickel and diming of inspection items. I'll just put a not to exceed number within that inspection clause, so that, you know, we're okay if they find a big item and it's a surprise to everybody, but we're not going to be nickel and diming and renegotiating. So, you know, not to exceed $5,000, for example. Yeah. Then if they want to do an inspection and just get a general idea of what their maintenance is going to be when they become homeowners, it's not going to be tied into renegotiating the contract. So yeah, I've used that quite a few times before, where I felt like, now they're going to come back with this inspection report and, you know, $500 here, $1,000 here, you know, yeah. And that really prevented them from doing that. And it's worked many times for me. So that might be helpful for anyone that's representing the seller side.
Yeah, and the standard inspection clause that is located within web forms does incorporate that dollar amount.
does,
So
yeah.
I mean, it's a useful tool. It's not on and to be clear, like there are a couple in there, but the one that the Victoria Real Estate Board has created doesn't account for something like that. But the
Yep.
one that is created through your BCFSA practice standards guidelines does incorporate that kind of verbiage and documentation. Yeah. And when you're talking with your buyer or your seller about that number, to make it clear that, you know, that $5,000 isn't allocated to obvious stuff. Like it's not, you know, that window needs to be replaced because it has a crack in it. Like it goes towards stuff that is discovered through the course of an inspection. So it's important to pay attention while you're obviously viewing and walking through and getting to know the home, because your inspection is going to bring things up that you don't know about, that you're not aware of, stuff that you may not reasonably find on your own accord or just happen chance walking through it. So it's yeah, it's a delicate balance, but it's good to have that conversation with your seller and also your buyer. You know, preparing them for all this kind of stuff is really important. And it's the same, you know, when you talk about, you know, insurance challenges or financing, you know, we're talking about walking through and looking at an old hot water tank. It's good to let your buyer know that that may be an issue, you know, getting insurance on the house, for example. And you know, when you're talking about financing, you know, make them aware that, you know, whoever you're working with, whether it's your bank or your mortgage broker, you know, you'll have some options, but be prepared to get all this stuff for them. And that's obviously, you know, it's good to have that sort of as part of your intake conversation or your initial meeting when you're going through agency and talking about the process. You know, maybe you don't have that sort of process conversation, you know, as far as working through a contract or purchase and sale when you're sitting in the office, but you should be having that conversation when you start looking at houses. So there is, as mentioned, there is, you know, a very significant library of terms and clauses that is available to you. So I would encourage you, if you're worried or you're thinking of you know, an issue, a subject clause can be written for everything. But if you read through all the ones that we do have in our practice standards manual, they are quite specific in most cases. There will be a measure. It will state that it's a subject clause, which identifies it as a condition of sale, not just a term, but an actual condition that requires you know, removal or waiver to enable to proceed. So they are all there. They're very specific. If we can't find one, we can draft clauses, but when we do, we have to make sure that there's a very clear measure as to who it is for and what the purpose of it is. If a subject clause has to be, if it's not associated with a buyer or seller, it will require obviously both parties to remove it. If it's for the sole benefit of a buyer, it actually allows the buyer a unilateral opportunity to remove that clause. They do not need the seller's consent or authorization to remove that clause. If there's no designation or it's for the sole benefit of the seller, then obviously both signatures will be required for the non-designated clause. It's that being said too, I've noticed you know, that subject removal forms are often just signed by the buyer. I think it is really good practice, and it should be everybody's best practice to have the seller sign that subject removal form or subject removal document that you send through them. You want to protect yourself, and you want to ensure that, one, you know, you're aware that the seller has received it, and getting them to sign that. And sometimes realtors will be like, well, it's not necessary. And honestly, moving forward, you can put that on me. Say, hey, look, the broker wants it, you know, can you please have the seller sign it and send it back? That gives us assurance and certainty that it has been received, and we're not going to run into any issues down the road. If something were to come up or a circumstance were to change, the seller could argue, I never got that, or that came late, or I didn't receive that on time. And there's nothing on that form to validate, that the seller has received it. So best practice I would recommend to you all is make sure that the seller signs those forms. Thoughts on that? Any questions? I see some puzzled looks. Nothing doing. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about the file that we had we were talking about yesterday, and it's with respect to tenant occupied properties. And when we're going through them, from a buyer's perspective, we're going to be creating or drafting contracts, and we should somehow indicate or identify any sort of tenancy agreement that's in the contract. You'll have a discussion with your buyer. Obviously, if the buyer's intent is to move into the property, then we need to draft a contract accordingly that allows them to move into the property. If they don't want to be a landlord, then we have to make sure that they're fully aware of how that's going to work, and how we can structure a contract so that they can get vacant possession. And we also need to make sure that they understand there's only, there's really only one option for you as a buyer to get vacant possession of a tenant occupied property. The Residential Tenancy Act in British Columbia is very extensive, and it is very tenant friendly. It can sometimes cause a lot of problems, and in particular when you're perhaps you're dealing with somebody that may not be all that familiar with the Residential Tenancy Act. Perhaps you're dealing with somebody out of province that believes, the tenancy rules and regulations from wherever they're coming from are the same in British Columbia. It has, caused a lot of challenges in the past, but we need to be aware of a couple of key factors. And, the one obviously is possession and what that looks like, as well as being clear as to, whose responsibility is it to do what. If you have a buyer that is looking for, vacant possession of a property because they want to move into it, we need to structure the contract that way. We need to make sure that it is written in the contract that they are going to get vacant possession, and there's specific instructions that the seller will provide the appropriate notice to the tenant. We need to make sure that the dates line up accordingly, and we need to make sure that we have enough time for everything to flow as smooth as possible. A lot of times the challenges will come up when the dates are quite tight, or we don't factor in a little bit of a grace period to allow potentially for some of the challenges that do come up. And significant challenges, usually include a challenge by the tenant or a tenant who's being a little bit stubborn. We've had an instance also where there was instruction for the seller to provide notice to the tenant, and the seller gave the wrong notice. The seller actually delivered the mutual agreement to end tenancy, and the tenant never signed it. Buyer got possession of the property. The tenant was still there and ended up having to basically negotiate and pay the tenant to leave because the seller neglected to fulfill their obligation under the contract, or the realtor actually did it incorrectly using the wrong documentation. And unfortunately, that ended up costing, the realtor and the buyer a little bit of money, and it was a situation that should have been avoided. So if you are working for a buyer and you do instruct your seller or the seller to give the appropriate notice to the resident or to the tenant, make sure you get a copy of that executed document back so that you can have it for your file. You don't want to just assume that it has been provided. You need to make sure that you have a copy of it because it is part of your transaction. And if you have to go back and review, one, it's going to confirm that the notice has been delivered. You can confirm with the date on the form that it has been delivered. It will tell you how it was delivered. So you'll be able to, follow the process along and not get caught off guard if something comes around. So that notice, the delivery of the notice to vacate, it is a standard form under the Residential Tenancy Act, and it is essentially notice to tenants notice to vacate. You'll have to indicate exactly what the reason is. And as I said, within the world of buying and selling, there really is only one viable reason for you to give notice to a tenant. So it's really important that we document this, and delivery of that has to be accounted for as well. So when we are preparing these contracts, and if we know that we're going to be serving notice to a tenant, we need to make sure that our subject removal is safe bet, like a week before the end of the month, if not sooner. Or we need to draft accordingly. Like, if we're not going to be able to make it, if we're not going to be able to remove our conditions, for example, until the 1st of March or the 2nd of March, we know that, April and May are going to be the notice period. So we're now looking at June if we want vacant possession of the property, unless of course there's the ability to negotiate with a tenant. But generally speaking, you're going to have to give 2 full clear months to the tenant. From a buyer's perspective as well, when you're writing your contract or drafting your contract, you want to ensure that the compensation that is owed to the tenant upon serving that notice is paid by the seller. You don't, assuming and this would be, for example, in a case where you took possession of a property prior to the tenant leaving. So if we were going to take possession March 2nd, for example, and the tenant had April and May to vacate, generally speaking, the seller or the landlord will tell the tenant not to pay the last month's rent to cover the compensation that's due and payable. So in your contract of purchase and sale, if you're going to be maintaining the tenant for a brief period after notice has been served for them to vacate, write in the contract that per the Residential Tenancy Act, the seller will pay the tenant the equivalent sum of 1 month's rent, per the Residential Tenancy Act. And if you need help drafting that out, just let me know. We've got I think we have a standard term there somewhere, but the RTA defines it very clearly, because the compensation technically is due and payable when you deliver notice. So if you deliver 60 days to a tenant to vacate the property, that triggers the payment, the compensation amount to be paid. It's payable with the notice. Andy?
Yeah, quick question on your potential buyer, if you're the agent for the buyer taking possession. Let's just say hypothetically that they're going to keep the tenant. It's a house with a suite downstairs or something. In a situation like that, not only would you want to ensure that the outgoing seller is paying, or not, I guess they wouldn't be paying for vacancies where you're keeping the tenant. Okay, so in this situation, what happens to the damage and pet deposit that was initially paid to the old owner or the outgoing owner?
Yeah. So if there was, and if you are keeping the tenant, you're going to make sure that you have a clause written into the contract that allows you the opportunity to review the tenancy agreement, as well as when the last rent increase was done, and all sorts of other little details like that. The pet deposit or the security or damage deposit that has been paid should be identified if they are in the tenancy agreement. Sometimes you won't get one, but you'll have to figure out what that is. So whatever those amounts are, your lawyer, the conveyancing lawyer, will always ask for those details if it's a tenant occupied property, and it will be factored in typically on your statement of adjustments. So the seller will credit the buyer with the deposit amounts through the course of the transaction. Clear? All right. Yeah, so following the tenancy discussion, if you do review the clauses and stuff that we do have, there are a number of tenant related clauses built into web forms. Please, if you have any questions, make sure you reach out to somebody, to me, or to a team leader or a team admin, or somebody that has a little bit knowledge. If you're unfamiliar with the situations, it can be very complicated. And there's a lot of risk, and there's a number of different scenarios that can play out when you are dealing with a tenant occupied property. The compensation note that we were just talking about, if we don't address that, and the seller says, oh, well, you can just have the last month's rent free. Basically, the seller is giving away a month's worth of rent. A buyer who's going to assume that tenant, for a month or two, as far as being able to get possession down the road, they're probably relying on having that rent come in. If there's nothing in there, or the last month free isn't an option, at least make sure that the buyer is aware that the seller is going to give them the last month free. So you, Mr. Buyer, although you're going to be the landlord, you're not going to get any rent unless we address it here in the contract. Any
I'm just going to add to, just everyone can wrap their heads around this whole thing, and because you're going to see it from a lot of seasoned agents, where you've got that clause that will allow a buyer to request the RTA, the notice for to serve that tenant, and alongside that, they have, under the possession, they have vacant possession, and they line those two up. You as an agent can't make any promises that that's going to work out the way that everyone likes. So be mindful. You'll get contracts from agents that have been in the business for a long time, and they write vacant possession in there for their client, and they write the notice. I scratched that vacant possession right out of there, and I just promised, look, we're going to serve the notice as per your request in there. If it's a lawful notice and your buyers sign it, we'll serve it. I don't get into the weeds with it. If that tenant decides he's going to stick around, that's just part of it, but you're not breaching the contract and making promises that may not be able to be fulfilled. So
yeah.
It's a big one. You'll see it all the time, and don't be afraid to scratch it out and say, I'm sorry, we can't make a promise, but we'll serve notice as per your clause with the right form. Yeah,
and we touched on that a little bit yesterday too. It's when just as we're walking through a property, and we're looking at potential items that are going to come up in inspections. Chances are, if the tenant is going to be challenging, you're going to be aware of that right away. You'll the listing realtor will let you know that they're having difficulty contacting the tenant, they're having trouble getting appointment confirmations. You're going to have a sixth sense of how that could potentially play out. That should also be something that you give consideration to when you're doing completion. Having a contract close the day of or the day after the tenant is supposed to be out can be and has been quite problematic. If they're assuming the tenancy, that's another story. But if the intent is, for your buyer to have vacant possession of the property, and possession is a negotiable term, just like everything else. So you'll have to determine what that looks like with your seller. If the window is really tight, like the day of or the day after, then obviously, you're going to want to make sure that the tenancy is addressed in the contract, because it could be subject to the end of tenancy. You have to ensure that, the tenant will be gone when they're supposed to be gone, or when they say they're going to be gone, and make sure that your possession lines up with that. Having a window is a really good tool and a really good way to avoid some of those complications, and potentially allows you the opportunity to deal with any of those complications that come up. If we have a tenant that's supposed to be out, February 28th, and we're hoping to move into the property at that time, from a buyer's perspective, and even from a listing agent's perspective, it's not a bad idea to have that completion date bumped out to the end of the next month. You can agree in principle to change that date down the road, but if not, be prepared to wait a month to get the property, and you'll have opportunity to potentially negotiate that. But if that tenant's not gone on the 28th of February, you're going to know. You're going to have a window of opportunity to try and manage that. From a seller's perspective, it can be very stressful if you've got a disgruntled tenant that's not going anywhere, and now all of a sudden you're supposed to be conveying a property to somebody who wants to move into it, and you can't. So keep a window and allow that, that whatever potential problem may come up, make sure you have a window to deal with any of those potential problems. Tenants disputing notice, for example, can take 3 months to get heard at the RTA, and then you still have to make sure they're gone. So pay attention to, obviously, the condition of the property, pay attention to the behavior of the tenant, pay attention to obviously what the listing realtor is telling you. And, if the tenant is there or present for some of the showings, try to engage them a little bit and prepare yourself for some of the worst case scenarios. And it's always important to be aware of all of the potential, because that's kind of how you'll temper and be able to mitigate a lot of the challenges that might arise.
Yeah, I would say if you have any expectation of a challenge moving forward, I've negotiated lots of mutual agreements in tenancy.
Yeah.
There's way more financial gain to be had for a tenant, so they're more excited about it. It's a stronger document, and you just negotiate it into the cost of the deal.
Yeah, that's an effective way to do it too. The challenge or the issue you have there, I mean, really is you'll require the tenant's signature on it, and if there's some compensation or a monetary benefit to them, they'll most likely be willing to do it, but they still have to leave. So even though they've signed a document, you still want to make sure that you have the ability to confirm that they're going to be gone before you're trying to complete a contract.
Hey,
Yep.
Darren,
Yeah,
would a disgruntled tenant that doesn't plan on leaving, if they verbally express that to the seller, would that be a material latent defect?
I don't think so. I mean, it's discoverable. If you're a seller and you have a tenant that is going to be a challenge, there's other avenues that you can take as well. Like Matt, like your tenant, they've caused you a lot of problems and challenges up there with that one listing that you have, and there's an argument that the seller could evict those tenants. The tenants have rights, but they also have obligations when it comes to occupying a property that's for sale. Building a relationship or trying to have an interview with the tenant to sort of talk about the process as a listing realtor can be obviously sometimes a little bit challenging, a little bit uneasy, a little bit quirky, but making sure that not only they're aware of their rights, but they have obligations as well, and they cannot do anything that impedes the process of sale. Impeding the process of sale, such as denying appointments, not cooperating for appointments when proper notice is given, and so on and so forth. Those are grounds for a seller to evict a tenant, and they can serve them 30 days notice for that. And is your hand up or is it still up? Yeah.
Yeah. I was just going to ask, the worst case scenario, if you've done all the proper things and you've gone down the proper channels of giving the notice to vacate and all that, and you've allotted the time, and you've even had a buffer for your buyer of a month to ensure that they were out, and for whatever reason, they're just super disgruntled and they're not going to leave. They're basically squatting, and it comes time for your buyer to move in because they sold their place and they got nowhere else to go. What recourse do you have? Like what do they do?
Worst case scenario like that, it's a bailiff issue. You have to, one, you get an order of possession, and then two, you get a bailiff to come in and move them out. And it can be a very lengthy process. I haven't seen it happen a lot. I have seen a couple of significant holdover tenants in the past. Usually when it gets that severe, they'll probably be a little bit of a delay, but generally the tenant will realize that they've got no option here. So it'll be a challenge. But the worst case, scenario is you have to spend a few $1,000s to go through the courts and get a bailiff in there to remove them.
Well, not only that, but the time spent with all your crap in a moving truck and you have no place to live. I mean, it can get very costly on many levels. I mean, you still got to carry on with your buyers still got to carry on with their life, go to work. Like, what can we do as agents to, protect our buyers from an eventuality like that? Or is there anything we can do?
Well, we just have to be aware. Like, we have to be aware of the potential, and we have to be able to recognize some signs. And then when we're drafting our contracts and we're structuring our offer, having that conversation about how this could play out in a worst case scenario is a good one to have with your buyers. Ultimately, we can draft the best written contract. We can build in all these protection measures. There's still an opportunity for a tenant to, disrupt that entire process. And sure, the tenant at law may be liable for damages, but I mean, good luck ever collecting that back, right? So awareness is the key. And from it's always, for some reason, there's always a little bit of hesitancy from a seller to evict a troubled tenant, or a lack of cooperation from a property manager willing to step in and manage the tenant appropriately as well, because they're just not interested and they don't want to deal with it. So as worse or as bad as it can be, the awareness is the key. And as you're moving forward, it's a conversation between buyer and seller. What does this look like? How can we prepare this? Having a good relationship with the seller, and understanding that if you're dealing with a troubled tenant, you guys should really be looking at it, viewing it as working together to complete the process. So the awareness at the onset is super important, and then keeping everybody informed as you move along. Build in your protections, build in your appropriate terms and your appropriate dates, and make sure you have it structured as best you possibly can. But on a rare occasion, I would say you'll have a holdover tenant that causes problems and challenges, but dealing with that will have to be it'll have to be a very well established and very cooperative relationship between buyer and seller. And that's where it's really important for us that we make sure that negotiation process stays clean and stays calm, and we maintain a good relationship with the other realtor. Even if the other realtor is a total prick or asshole, for example, we have to swallow our pride and swallow our ego at times and do what we can to maintain that good relationship so that we can get to where we need to be.
I'm wondering if there's ever been a situation where, the worst has happened, the tenant isn't vacating. If there was some sort, and maybe both sides had a feeling of this going into it, but they, for whatever reason, they really wanted the property, knowing that there could be issues. I wonder if, there's ever been a situation where you gave them the notice to vacate, but then had like a plan B, as opposed to having to go through all the proper channels to get the bailiff to evict and have all these hearings and spend all this time, money, hardship. If the seller and the buyer going into it would have had that plan B, like a mutual agreement to vacate, as here, I know that you're upset, you don't want to leave, you've been living here for 10 years renting, how's about we give you this? And you have the buyer and seller agree on that going into it. I wonder if that's something that would be a possibility as opposed
you could. The mutual agreement, I mean, it's almost moot if you serve legal notice. And in the end, it's not going to be worth the paper it's written on unless the tenant signs it. And in worst case scenarios, it's going to depend on it'll depend on the people involved. It'll depend on the clients, the sellers and the buyers. There was a holdover incident once at a property I dealt with in Kimberley, and it was a week after completion. Notice had been given, Everything was done clean and proper. The tenant was not moving. They hadn't even started packing a single thing. The buyer was bold enough to go to the house and start and walk in the house and start moving the tenant's stuff out onto the front lawn and said, keep it here as long as you want. And then just started moving the tenant out of the house. I don't know personally if I would be that bold, but you know, there's who knows? It's going to depend on the individual, right?
Is that legal? Could he?
No.
He could do that?
Yeah,
No.
what's the repercussions for that?
He never was challenged on it. He had the legal right to occupy the property. The tenant had an obligation to be gone. So, I mean, I don't know, you know, I don't know how that would play out in a court.
Kind of like assuming the role of bailiff. It's kind of vigilantism in a way.
A little bit, yeah. If you are evicting somebody or you are moving somebody out, though, you do have the obligation to store their property for a certain amount of time, which obviously can incur costs. And you know, if they want to get their stuff back, the technical aspect would be for them to pay the cost of storing it. But it is really tricky, and you know, hopefully we won't see, you know, too many of these sort of extreme cases come up, but they do happen. And you know, all we can do is the best we can and make sure that our contracts are written properly and we have everything incorporated properly. And then just understand what the resources available and just be aware of the potential that could happen, because it's the lack of awareness sometimes that actually creates some of the challenges.
Yeah, I think the takeaway here, and the thing that I like the best out of this is, you know, just preparing your clients in a situation like this for, you know, potentially the worst case scenario. So, you know, they're informed going in.
That's 100% it, and that's why they hire you. You know, they hire you so they can learn about this stuff, or so you can help them navigate through this process. They don't know this process. You know, the more years we spend in this business, you know, there's thousands of transactions that, you know, you're going to help clients walk through, and that's your job. Your job is to guide them through this process. And you know, at the end of the day, they get the house and we get paid, but your job is to walk them through this process and keep them out of trouble. And if you don't do that, then you're going to get in trouble, because that's your one sole responsibility as far as legislation, as far as regulation. Your job is to make sure they're looked after. It's consumer protection.
Darren, if you had a really apprehensive buyer and they're just not comfortable with the potential of the home not being vacant at possession, can there be a term in the contract, much like we use it with a deficiency walkthrough, where we, you know, 10 days prior to completion, you know, obviously the dates need to be far enough out where the tenant's supposed to be gone, confirm that it's vacant, and if not, mutually agree to extend the dates accordingly, and maybe even at a cost to the seller per month.
Yeah,
that would alleviate all of that, really, if you had a buyer that just was absolutely not comfortable with being in that 0.5% that's going to end up with a tenant when they're not supposed to be there.
Yeah, you can write that term or structure that term in a way where it gives the buyer the unilateral right to extend the completion date at their option. If they choose not to extend it and the seller still can't provide, you know, possession of the property, then the buyer would have the ability to move on, maintain their deposit, and move on to another property if eventually got frustrated. But having a term like that to extend for the, you know, unilaterally, not requiring the seller's signature, but you should always get you should always get everybody's signature on every piece of paper. But if you allow them the sole ability to, you know, bump it out another 30 days, you know, up to, you know, 3 times or 4 times or whatever it is, but, you know, have some sort of end date there. But ultimately, you know, hopefully if that challenge does arise, the seller will be a little bit proactive, and you know, we'll get there. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Jackie,
I have a question.
Yeah.
If the tenant, if you agree to, let's say, pay out on the buyer's side, you agree to pay out the tenant, should you have that outside of the contract? get them to sign that mutual agreement saying that they're going to be vacating the property. Should that be outside of the contract, or is that part of the contract? Because I had that situation with a deal. The deal didn't go through, but my buyer was willing to pay the $15,000 to have vacant possession because we knew she was kind of troublesome. Would you put that in the contract, or would you have a whole separate agreement?
Well, that's a negotiation between the buyer client and the tenant. It would be through the seller. The mutual agreement to end tenancy would have to be initiated by the seller. So they would require that signature. I don't know if I would put that in the contract of purchase and sale. You would have in the contract the seller to deliver notice or whichever, and then termage around possession and that kind of stuff. But you can negotiate that, on a side note, as long as the tenant is willing to have a conversation, and as long as the seller gives you, consent to have that conversation with their tenant, you can absolutely have that agreement in place. I would not certainly pay them up front. Maybe
No. Pay
a
them
little bit
after.
up front, and the balance when the house is clean and empty. But yeah, no, you can negotiate, and if they sign it, that's great.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Hey, Darren, further to what Dallas was just speaking of there and adding a term to unilaterally extend the possession date to ensure that the tenant is in fact gone. It being a term, if the tenant doesn't leave, are you able to collapse the offer because of it? Or would it have to be a subject? You are.
No, if the buyer does not exercise their right to extend completion, then the deal will become frustrated. It would be, so that the seller has an obligation to provide possession of the property under certain terms. If the seller can't provide that possession, the buyer will essentially have the option on the contract because the seller's in breach.
So isn't that just in a roundabout way of asking for vacant possession, sort of?
If that's your intent, yeah. Like if you as the buyer, or your buyer doesn't want to be a landlord, there are lots of people out there that do not want to deal with tenants and do not want the problems that come along with being a landlord. If they don't know anything about the Residential Tenancy Act, if they really want to move into that place, we need to structure the contract so that we can get them vacant possession. Yeah.
So I'm the buyer's agent. I'm representing my buyer. The time comes around to move in. They haven't moved in. We have that term in there saying, hey, you know what? We want to extend it for 30 more days.
Yeah.
But we still don't think that they're going to leave. So in fact, we're not going to extend it at all. We're just backing out. Do you get your deposit back then?
Yeah. And you could add an additional term because the seller is the one in breach. So if the seller can't provide possession per the contract, then it will be the seller in breach of contract.
Well, they're basically, the seller's not providing vacant possession.
Yeah.
The possession would be there, but the tenant's still there. So it's just a crafty roundabout way of asking for vacant possession, in my opinion.
Well, the challenge there though is if you take ownership and possession of the property, you are now the landlord. The seller is gone. They're free and clear of any obligations or challenges they have with the tenant. If you complete that transaction, you, Mr. Buyer, are now the landlord. And now, so you're going to assume all of the responsibilities and challenges of trying to deal with the tenant as opposed to insisting that the seller deals with it because you don't want to deal with them in the first place.
I'm curious, Dallas, have you ever actually used that tactic, or were you just like kind of brainstorming thing, this could be a thing, right?
I haven't used that one in particular, but I've kind of used that same mechanism for a delayed completion. I wanted to keep a deal alive, and the builder basically didn't want to promise anything, and due to COVID and delays, and I just said, well, we'll put an option to extend this out. same sort of idea, so that the deal could stay alive. And so it's just a modification of that sort of unilateral option to move dates out to accomplish something, right?
It's not unlike the outside date term
Right.
in most builder contracts. Like we're gonna plan to complete on this day. However, I, as the builder, if I can't do this, will we'll provide it within a 3-month period or a 4-month period or whatever it is, and then there'll be a term in there that says we'll give you a 10 days notice of what the actual completion date will be. So it's really the same term as that outside date completion in all new build contracts.
Yeah, and you could just tie in a cost to carry. If, like you say, Andy, you've got now they get a moving truck and they've got to rent somewhere else, they can just put that cost back on the seller's side of the ledger there, to make it all work.
Yeah.
What, like via holdback or something like that, or just
or at closing on the statement of adjustments, adjust for whatever that if it was at 3 months and what was the agreed cost per month, and that just goes to your buyer's side of the ledger.
If the seller has an obligation to provide it and they can't, and you're willing to work with them, in addition to that unilateral ability to extend completion in 30-day increments, you can add another term in there that says for every extension of completion, the seller will credit the buyer $2,000 a month or something like that.
Okay, let's turn this around. Now you're the listing agent. You get something like this. How are you going to protect your client?
Scratch it all out.
Scratch it all out. But having maybe you, from a seller's perspective, want the ability to agree or extend. Maybe you're scratching out any monetary benefit. Maybe as a seller, you might not be wanting to sign that contract or accept that contract at all. That's really sort of the tough part is, there really isn't, a standard process in it's, it'd be easy. Well, I mean, if all contracts were exactly the same, but we have the ability to create any number of terms and obligations within a contract purchase and sale. So from a seller's perspective, everything is a negotiation. So what's reasonable? What's a reasonable expectation for me? Am I going to be able to do this? Yeah, I'll probably be able to do this. If we have a little bit of a window, that's fine. I'm feeling relatively comfortable. If you're in a situation where you've had trouble with, a tenant, for example, or it's going to be a challenge, it's beneficial to have that outside date or that window to manage it, and know that it can take a little bit of time. So it's a negotiation, and it doesn't have to be, we sometimes get involved in contracts and negotiations where we're fighting each other, we're combating each other, and we really need to focus on working together and finding a cooperative solution around problems, especially when the problem is outside of the seller or the buyer. When we're dealing with a third party, Mr. Seller, Mr. Buyer, how are we going to work this out together? How can we make this work? I want to buy your house. You want to sell me your house. How can we make this work? I know we have a problem, but let's figure it out.
Jeez, as a buyer's agent in a situation like this, like, it seems like there's a lot of pressure on us to ensure that we kind of suss out what kind of a person this potential tenant is, just to get an idea of, whether or not you even want to write on the property. So, I mean, how would you go about, meeting this tenant? You're just going to go knock on their door, say, hey, you want to go for a beer or a coffee? Like, how do you do this,
Well, I mean, the whole interaction is going to start when, you request a viewing. The listing agent will probably tell you if they're having trouble getting a hold of the tenant, or, most likely if it's a challenging tenant, the listing agent will give you a heads up, say, hey, the tenant's, a little on edge. They're probably going to be there. this is a history of their behavior and that kind of stuff. So, I mean, at the very onset of the listing or the viewing appointment, you're going to know, how, if, you'll have some idea of how it may play out or the scale of what you need to be prepared for.
Whether they're willing to play ball or not. Yeah. True enough.
Yeah. And as I said too, most are, but there are definitely some out there that can cause us a lot of problems. And, for a tenant, to dispute something, or a tenant to, claim wrongful notice, if a buyer doesn't move in, like there's some significant monetary penalties involved in that. And like it can be, $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 really easily if improper notice is given, or if, thousands of dollars if you have to get a bailiff involved and stuff. So it can be, it can be quite significant. And I promise you, your client is going to hold you responsible for it. Unless we've done everything we can do to protect them and make sure we get, to the right place. But ultimately, your client will hold you responsible, because they're hiring you to make sure that they don't end up in this situation.
I think I want to become a listing agent, period. No more buyers.
It's not a bad model. There's a lot of realtors out there who hire buyer agents. All they do is list properties. So, hey everybody, it is 10:06. Is there anything further on today's discussion? Seeing none, hearing none. Well, I appreciate your attendance. I appreciate your participation. Thank you very much. And don't hesitate to reach out and give me a call or shoot me a text if you have any questions.
Thanks, Darren. Appreciate your time.
Thanks, everybody.
Have a good day, everyone.
Have a great day.
Thank you.